Robyn's money from her house paid family debts. You get in this space with family.
The air felt thick enough to slice, the sort of hush a room keeps when thunder is skulking just beyond the clouds. And although the gavel had not yet descended, every soul inside the courtroom seemed to brace for the blow. Mr. Kody Brown rose with deliberate slowness, a slight, weathered folder pinched between his fingers as though it weighed 100 weights. And when he set it down upon the claimant's table, it landed with the dull, resonant thud of a warning drum, prompting heads to lift, backs to stiffen, and the last murmur to wither on the tongue. For this was not simply a quarrel over brass tacks, but something older and more elemental. A reckoning of truths once whispered and now hauled blinking into daylight. Across from him, Mrs. Robyn Brown sat tight as a held breath. Her counsel pitched close at her shoulder, their whispers threadbare against the vast silence, and the gallery wives separated by grievances they had tried to file neatly into drawers, kin flanked by half-formed loyalties. Rubberneckers and reporters alike leaned forward with the involuntary tilt of people about to witness a tide turn. The judge cleared his throat in that slightly peevish way of magistrates who suspect melodrama but will permit it if it delivers substance, and invited Mr. Brown to proceed with evidence, not elegy, whereupon Kody, whose jaw carried the work of Doug Da. The judge cleared his throat in that slightly waywell try in the way, as I tell the dog. As I tell what we spewed at one, my Doug Dog Ba. And we see with Cugdoff stock, Cog Dog Bug, Ella Dob McQuy Doug Dog. If Dog Da was at Will F, with a cow fight we dob Doug Doll, I see you with CHAF with Kaka K to see with Ed Da Kali Ka Pi to be Kata you to Kai to go to call I can like to Kai to you to go to the Q like Guy to wick on at to get to with Kaka to wick Kabai at long years and long disappointments. Spoke not as a grand orator, but as a man who has been living with splinters in his palms. His voice trimmed to a steady Anglo-Saxon plainness. For years, unity. For years, common cause. For years, every coin. And dream declared communal. And yet here, laid between thumb and forefinger, sat a deed that was never tabled. A purchase never declared. A house belonging to Robyn alone, bought for a sum that would sound modest on paper but monstrous against the ledger of omission. And you could feel the first collective intake of breath, a small wave before a breaker as the clerk accepted the paper. The judge squinted, and the wives, each in her own choreography of betrayal, reacted. Christine folded her arms like a barricade across a quickly beating heart. Janelle tipped forward in the alert posture of someone who has smelt petrol. Mary sat statue-like, and yet her quiet was louder than anyone's outrage. Robyn moved at last, only the smallest twitch. A tightening about the mouth and a whitening of the knuckles where her hands clamped the table. And her counsel rose, jacket smoothed, voice clipped to a professional shard temporary shelter. Your lordship, a purchase of necessity during a time of familial unrest. No intention to mislead in the bench, whose patience extends precisely to the edge of a half-truth. Noted in tones dry as bones, that necessity is not disclosure, and disclosure is the minimum price of trust. So Mr. Brown turned a page, and suddenly the room had that feeling old churches sometimes carry when a door opens to a draft cold and expectant. And the next document slid out with soft fatality, a statement showing transfers that had not breathed, the air of a shared audit, round sums scuttling at the edges of daylight. Payments arranged with an almost clockmaker's care to avoid ordinary scrutiny. And if money speaks in a plainer accent than people, then this money cleared its throat. In Queen's English, for the numbers told their tale without embroidery. At this, Robyn's denial arrived in a voice that tried to be steady and failed. The kind of protest that smells faintly of last stands. And the gavel rapped Mrs. Brown, not out of turn after which the judge asked for order and got something. Like it, the gallery settling into a tense stillness that amplifies whispers into cannon fire. Further evidence came. A run of wires a banker might admire for its tidiness, were it not so cursed. And emails. Two noisy little things wherein the language bore the clinical scent of advice sought for hiding rather than safeguarding. And that was the moment the moral geometry of the room tilted, because nasty sums can still be forgiven as blunders. But planning is a choice, and choices are moral. Fears were offered as fig, leaves children uncertainty. The family's structural wobblebutt, fear does not grant a license to blindfold those who share your roof. And the judge, who had the mien of a schoolmaster who has discovered more than one cheat sheet in the same exam, announced that intention is not absolution, and process would resume with testimony. Up stepped Christine, heels clicking with the stubborn rhythm of someone who has decided to spend her bravery rather than hoard it. And her account was the sort of calm that carries a sharper edge than fury. Talk of sanctuary that now presented itself. Less as metaphor and more as brickwork. And then Janelle, braced like a warrant, told of arithmetic that had never quite reconciled. Long hours, small economies, and a gnawing sense that someone, somewhere, had patted the ground for a solo landing. Mary said little, she has always said little, but the grief in her quiet suggested the kind of knowledge one acquires by sitting with the worst possibility long enough that it no longer knocks before entering. Again the documents. Again the resigned rustle of paper rendered heavy by context. Again the judge, who has no appetite for opera yet finds himself presiding over one. The room learned then of a second property nested behind the veil of a cousin's. Named the payments routed from the same covert account. The neatness of the pattern doing the prosecution's work for them. And you could feel the wife's shock transmute into that hard, cold clarity that replaces doubt with a list, for the arithmetic of betrayal grows teeth when it becomes cumulative. The defense attempted once more the language of mitigation instability. Panic, survival but panic, is frantic and messy. And what lay before the court had the crisp edges of forethought. And then, because stories do not content themselves with money when they can meddle with loyalty, Kody laid down correspondence that spoke not only of funds cordoned off from a communal purse, but of plans to transfer custodianship of futures to trusts explicitly built to exclude. And the judge, who until then had struck the posture of a man tolerating theater in exchange for facts, leaned in, because the line between emergency and exit is not merely legal, but existential. Robyn broke into tears, the humankind. Not the photogenic hand, insisted that fear had tightened its hands about her throat. That a mother will do what a mother must when tides turn vicious, and for a second you could almost see the jury split, along a fault line that is as old as families, between those who judge by act and those who judge by cause. Yet Mr. Brown, who had come to this pitched moment wearing a carapace woven of pragmatism and hurt, answered not with heat but with that gentler cruelty truth sometimes exacts, call them not mistakes. He said, call them decisions, and the word hung like a bell. The judge, to his credit or to his doom, depending on your appetite for tidy resolutions, insisted upon the slow work of corroboration and summoned the next witness. And so the afternoon elongated into that twitchy twilight law courts get, when the light starts to leach from the windows and everyone knows the day will not end in peace. Statements were read. Exhibits were numbered. Objections were lodged and either endured or dismissed with the flick of a learned hand. And even the court, reporter whose stoicism is usually imperial, paused once. The keys resting beneath the fingers as if language itself had tired. And then a twist the writers of lesser dramas would call contrived, but which real life favors when it wishes to educate her daughter. Aurora, summoned not by appetite for spectacle, but because truth, having been dragged thus far, refuses to stop at the water's edge. She stood like young courage stands, trembling and upright, and told the room what the room half knew and could not forgive, that she had gone with her mother to the house, that she had been made custodian of a secret not fit for a child to carry, and the keening sound that followed part gasp, part prayer, part Kurzek's planed. Better than any Cusey's crafted phrase, why courts are poor theaters for the sentencing of love. The judge halted the swell with a single crack and ordered a recess, the kind that leaves everyone stranded inside their heads. And when they returned, the tenor had shifted, as if the walls had absorbed enough story to declare a position of their own, and the evidence kept coming, ugly in its tidiness. Until even those inclined to mercy began to weigh it against an arithmetic of omissions too regular to be accidental. And yet, because narratives with only one villain are for bedtime, what began outside on the courthouse steps as a stung outburst hardened into allegation when the defense produced a fresh folder and laid before the court movements of funds, with Mr. Brown's name stitched into them, and the hunter felt the eyes of the hounds. It is one thing to punish a single betrayal, quite another to stare down the double mirror where accuser and accused have both been writing entries in the red ledger. The judge, who had criticized theatrics earlier, now looked every inch the tragic actor, for his face carried the knowledge that families seldom perish of one wound alone. And when the heavy binders arrived subpoenaed in nocturnal industry, they landed with the finality of a stone door, and the sums inside timed with a cleverness the clever often mistake for innocence. Answered the only open question still rattling about the room, whether this was a story of a rogue or a culture. Testimony fractured, rage flared, tears did their work, and still the arithmetic stood. Each neat figure a footstep, and the conclusion, when it came, felt less like a gavel than a diagnosis, both guilty of concealment, both disqualified from the stewardship they had used as a screen, the estate to be unwound with the cold patience of auditors, and the remainder put beyond the reach of those who had most loudly claimed the right to shepherd it. And if anyone expected catharsis, they misread the genre. For punishment is a kind of truth, but not the restorative kind. And as the wives wept the peculiar tears of people both vindicated and bereaved, and as the gallery erupted into the buzz of carrying curiosity, and as Robyn's sobs pitched themselves up the scale into the sharpness of an animal hurt, and as Kody stood very still in that posture men adopt when holding themselves together with the last thread of pride, the judge adjourned with a line that has been spoken before and will be spoken again. Truth is not an optional extra, and brought the hammer down, ending not the story, but the illusion that stories of this sort ever end cleanly. Outside, the press scrum performed its ugly ballet. Inside, the lawyers packed away their cleverness as one might fold a winter coat at the end of a season. And the room, its appetite sated and its heart sore, exhaled. But corridors keep echoes, better than sanctuaries, and as the principals drifted apart like flotsam after a storm, the echo that lingered was not the verdict, but the question it had uncovered. If secrets are the currency with which this family paid for its togetherness, what remains for tender now that the purse is empty? The courthouse steps had scarcely cooled from the weight of boots, heels, and cameras when the echo of the gavel still beat inside every ribcage. The verdict a drum whose rhythm refused to still, and though the judge had adjourned with a warning, cloaked as wisdom, truth is not optional, the throng outside howled for more. For in truth, people seldom leave a feast of scandal half-eaten. Reporters barked questions like hounds straining at the leash. Bystanders jostled for vantage, and family members, each bent in a posture of grief or fury, found themselves reduced to characters in a drama performed for a public they had not invited. Yet the storm had scarcely found its eye when Robyn, racked with tears but sharpened by bitterness, snapped that she would not bear the burden alone, that secrets did not sit solely in her lap. And the murmur which followed was the kind of collective intake one hears when an orchestra pauses just before a discordant crash. And Kody, who had stood with the steel of vindication only moments earlier, paled, his jaw tightening, his silence becoming an admission more terrible than words. Christine's cry, half disbelief, half fury, cut through the air, Janelle's voice shook with the tremor of realization. Mary's silence once again the loudest accusation of all. And the reporters, those scavengers of human ruin, surged forward with pens poised like bayonets. And it was then that the bailiff, red-faced and panting, called them back, not outside, not on the steps where spectacle flourishes, but back into the courtroom itself. For the judge had declared an emergency hearing, and this was the sort of twist that makes the ground quiver. For what had seemed a single-handed betrayal was about to unravel into a ledger of duplicities shared. Inside once more, the chamber groaned beneath the press of bodies. The atmosphere sulphurous, the light itself brittle, and the gavel hammered with a violence that demanded obedience. Silencing all but the pounding of hearts, and the judge, his countenance granite, fixed his gaze on Robyn, demanding evidence of the counter-allegation she had hurled like a spear outside, and trembling though she was, Robyn rose with the stubbornness of a woman who has been stripped to tatters and now embraces ruin as armor. And her lawyer, reluctant yet bound, slid across a fresh folder whose contents made the clerk's hands tremble as he delivered it to the bench. The judge rifled through, his brow knitting deeper with each line. The gallery leaning forward as though proximity might grant comprehension. And when the magistrate's eyes narrowed to slits, it was clear that the documents bore the stink of authenticity, transfers, signatures, withdrawals that traced a pattern of secrecy beneath Kody's stern sermons, and the silence which followed his first demand, "Mr. Brown, are these yours?" was worse than any confession. For silence, when it arrives in the place of denial, does not whisper but roar. Christine's sob cracked the air. Janelle whispered a prayer wrapped in a curse. Mary stared at her clasped hands as though the lines there might rewrite history. And Kody, pale and taut, managed only that it was strategy, foresight, preparation for the family's future, but strategy without disclosure is simply deceit by a prouder name. And the judge said as much, banging the gavel so hard the walls rattled dust from the rafters. And the gallery erupted in disbelief, because the man who had wielded betrayal like a blade against his wife was revealed to have honed a second blade behind his back. Pandemonium swelled, order was called and broken and called again. And in the midst of it, Christine rose from the gallery, her voice cracked but unflinching, shouting that she could not bear to hear more. That years of sacrifice now lay in ruins. At their feet, her words trembling the rafters more than the gavel could. And Janelle pulled her down again, whispering, "Not now, not yet," while Mary muttered almost inaudibly that perhaps the family had never been destroyed from without, but had been rotting from within all along. And it was in that moment the courtroom felt smaller than a coffin, the air itself suffocating, because secrets shared are heavier than secrets alone. Far, and everyone sensed that the narrative had slipped beyond betrayal into something deeper. Hypocrisy, the twin-edged ruin that spares no one. Binders were summoned fat, with subpoenas answered under the cover of night. Their thuds upon the table heavier than gravestones. And inside them lay a cartography of Kody's own omissions. Withdrawals at times when cupboards were bare, offshore. Transfers written in a hand that could be none but his. Sums of such size that they mocked every plea of poverty the wives had ever endured. And the women, each in her own register, responded Christine with a sob so sharp it cut the air. Janelle, with a muttered fury about double shifts and bent backs. Mary, with tears falling as silently as stones into water, and, if Robyn, broken though she was, found a shred of vindication in that moment, it was the kind that tastes of ashes. For she pointed and cried that now they could all see he was no better. And Christine shot back with venom that neither was she, and the court dissolved once more into a theater of screams, sobs, flashes from cameras, until the judge, now trembling with rage, thundered that both were guilty. Both had lied, both would bear punishment, and the room froze because nobody had expected the symmetry of damnation. The verdict of guilt was not merely legal, it was moral, it was communal. Stripped Kody of the patriarch's cloak he had worn so tightly and left him bare. stripped Robyn of the shroud of fear she had wielded as excuse. It left both revealed as artisans of deceit, and the punishment the stripping of authority. The liquidation of hidden assets, the exile from the estate fell like a guillotine, leaving the gallery gasping, the reporters scribbling. The wives crushed between vindication and devastation, for justice may balance the scales, but it seldom heals the wound. Yet even then, with the gavel's thunder still echoing, the air did not relax, because everyone knew the most perilous moment was yet to come. The sentencing that would decide not merely property, but legacy. Not merely two culpable adults, but the survival or dissolution of an entire family structure. And so, the day ended not in resolution, but in suspended terror. A recess declared, the crowd spilling into corridors thick with gossip, the wives leaning against one another as though they alone could hold the roof upright. Robyn collapsed against her counsel in sobs of both grief and strange triumph. Kody stiff and silent, his mask shattered, but his pride muttering rebellion beneath the ruin. And in the echoing chamber, now emptied of bodies but haunted by truth, the question lingered like smoke, too heavy to rise. If both sides have traded in deceit, what punishment could be proportionate? What judgment could be just? And what remains when the very concept of family has been proved counterfeit? The recess had not yet cooled the marble floors when the corridors of the courthouse filled with whispers thick as smoke, each voice carrying fragments of ruin and speculation. And by the time the doors opened again, the gallery was swollen with reporters, relatives, strangers drawn by rumor, the air feverish with expectation. And when the judge re-entered, robes heavy as stone, his face carved in fatigue, yet lit with a kind of merciless duty, silence slammed down like a slab of granite, and all present knew they had come not merely for sentencing, but for dissolution. The sort of judgment that does not wound but amputates. Kody sat rigid, jaw clenched, his mask of patriarchal certainty cracked wide open, yet still clung to as if fragments could shield him. Robyn hunched at the defense table, tissue shredded in her fists, her sobs raw but defiant beneath Christine. Janelle and Mary in the gallery like sentinels of betrayed trust. Eyes bloodshot, spines taut, hands trembling as though gripping railings of a ship about to sink. And when the gavel fell, its echo seemed to close the exits, and the judge's voice, deep and deliberate, declared that both had been found guilty of concealment, of manipulation, of treachery to the very principle of togetherness they had sworn before kin and court alike. And therefore both would be stripped of control. Both would forfeit the hidden assets, both would be banished from custodianship of the estate, the family legacy to be dissolved, the wealth scattered to wives and children untouched by the deceit. And the gasp that rolled through the gallery was not merely surprise but bereavement, for whatever remained of unity had now been pronounced dead by decree. Christine sobbed, clutching at Janelle, whose fury trembled through clenched fists. Mary wept with that quietness that stabs deeper than any cry. Robyn wailed as though the sentence had broken her ribs. Kody muttered in disbelief, shouting once that no judge had the right to dismantle his family, and the gavel thundered him into silence with the words that seared into every listening ear. You forfeited that right when you chose dishonesty. In that instant, the myth of patriarchal invulnerability, the myth of fear-ridden innocence collapsed like rotten beams. Yet still the storm did not abate. For as the verdict emptied into the waiting world beyond the doors, the steps became a theater of chaos. Cameras flashing like lightning, microphones jabbing like spears, reporters shouting questions. Christine breaking down in tears that spattered her own words of bitterness. This is not a game. This is our ruined Janelle muttering through clenched teeth that secrets had always been the family's poison. Mary whispering perhaps the world needed to see this wreckage laid bare. And Kody stiff with denial while Robyn, half broken and half blazing, lashed back with accusations that he too had built secret lifeboats. that no one in the family was innocent. And for a moment, the gallery of public opinion swelled with the intoxicating thrill that betrayal had metastasized in every direction. The bailiff herded them back into the chamber for an emergency hearing. And once again, the gavel cracked. Once again, the judge thundered for order. Once again, the floor became the stage for revelations that gnawed further at the carcass of trust. Fresh folders sliding across desks, binders flung open to reveal accounts. Transfers, signatures that bore Kody's hand. The silence of his non-denial louder than any cry. Christine's sobs breaking. Janelle's curses rising. Mary whispering that perhaps it had always been wrought within, and the room swayed with the realization that both husband and wife had built their own fortresses of lies. And the punishment now could no longer be measured by ledger alone, but by the demolition of legacy itself. And so the judge rose, voice hammering against the air, pronouncing dissolution of the estate, liquidation of every concealed coin, expulsion of Kody and Robyn from any custodianship, and the wives gasped as though their lungs had been ransacked. Christine whispering finally, justice, Janelle muttering, never again. Mary trembling with the grief of a matriarch who knows ashes cannot be rebuilt into hearths. And Robyn's howls clawed the ceiling whilst Kody sat pale, fists trembling, pride in tatters, and reporters scribbled madly because history was being inked. And when the final gavel struck, the sound tolled like a funeral bell, declaring not only judgment but erasure, for families may fracture, but to dissolve them in law is to write their obituary. And as the courtroom bled into corridors and stairwells, as journalists swarmed like carrion birds, as Christine leaned on Janelle, as Mary stumbled with vacant eyes, Robyn was half carried by her lawyer. As Kody strode stiff into flashbulbs like a condemned general, the air itself tasted of endings. Yet even endings whisper of continuations, and in the crackle of voices. In Robyn's last shriek, that others too kept secrets. In Kody's stiff silence that betrayed more than protest. In Mary's whisper that perhaps this family had died one secret at a time, long before the gavel named its corpse, the audience be. Vague jurors, kin, or strangers watching the tempest from afar knew that dissolution was not closure. For the ruins of trust are never final. They smolder, and in their smoldering breed rumors. In rumors breed doubts. In doubts breed the seed of darker reckonings yet to come. So that when the doors closed at last and silence reclaimed the courtroom, it was not peace that remained, but the suffocating weight of a truth too vast to contain. That secrets, once unleashed, never stop with the guilty. They bleed into every vein of those who touch them, and the Brown family, stripped, shattered, and dissolved, were not merely victims of judgment, but architects of their own apocalypse, and the world outside, eager and unblinking, waited for the next collapse. For, even as the ink on the verdict dried, new whispers ran through the crowd like sparks on dry tinder. What if the lies stretched further? What if the children knew more than they had confessed? What if the wives, in their righteous grief, had concealed wounds of their own? And in those whispers, a new narrative was forming, one that suggested the trial was not a finale, but an overture. Not the burial of secrets, but the exhumation of deeper rot. And every step Kody took down those courthouse stairs, every sob Robyn choked out into her lawyer's sleeve, every flash of the reporter's camera seared into the minds of those watching, not as closure, but as prologue to a saga still unraveling. And in that atmosphere, heavy as a brewing storm, the family that had once styled itself as united under covenant was revealed, not merely fractured, but pulverized. Each shard glinting with the potential to cut anew, and the city, the nation, perhaps even the world beyond, leaned closer, hungrier, sensing that when legacies fall, they do not fall. Silently, they detonate, they echo, they draw others into their collapse. And so, the night that followed was not a night of rest, but of fevered conversations. Taverns and kitchens buzzing with speculation. Radios replaying snippets of testimony. papers hastily printed with headlines that screamed betrayal. While within the houses of those most entangled, Christine staring sleepless at her ceiling, Janelle pacing until dawn, Mary clasping her hands in a prayer she was not sure she still believed, Kody sitting rigid in a hotel room like a statue of denial, Robyn rocking herself until her sobs broke into silence. The echoes of the gavel still rang. Merciless, unforgettable, the sound of trust executed by its own keepers. The gavel may have struck for the final time, yet its echo lingers in every corner of that courtroom, reverberating not only through marble walls, but through the very hearts of those who once called themselves a family. And as Kody walked out stiff and pale, Robyn broke down in sobs. Christine clung to Janelle, whispering that justice had finally spoken, and Mary stood trembling with tears that seemed older than the trial itself. The truth was clear. This was not simply the end of a case. It was the burial of a legacy. For betrayal, once revealed, does not fade into silence. It spreads like fire, searing memories, dismantling trust, and leaving behind nothing but the ash of what could have been. And so the Browns judged guilty, stripped of their estate, exposed, before the world became not only subjects of law but warnings to us all. Reminders that secrets do not remain buried forever, they claw their way to the surface, demanding to be heard, tearing down the illusions built upon them. And as reporters swarmed, cameras flashed, and whispers turned into headlines, one haunting question lingered in the air. If such deception can corrode those who once stood proclaiming unity, then what of the secrets the rest of us carry? What of the truths we hide behind closed doors? How long before our own gavels fall? And here, as the dust settles on this tempest, you have been watching with Starspill USA, where the stories go beyond the courtroom, beyond the verdict, into the heart of betrayal and truth itself. Because justice is never quiet, secrets are never still, and the echoes of both will follow us long after the doors close.